chapter of the Gospel according to St. Luke. Now, a certain man came up to Jesus and said, "Teacher, tell my brother to give me my fair share of the family inheritance." And Jesus said to him, "My friend, who has appointed me as the judge or arbitrator over your family affairs?" And then he said, "Be careful. Be on guard against every kind of greed, because your life does not consist in the abundance of your possessions." And then he told him a parable. He said, "The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And the man said, 'I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't have anywhere to store all my grain.' And then he thought to himself, 'I know what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns, and I'll build bigger barns, and then I'll have plenty of room to store my goods and my grain. And then I'll say to myself, Self, you have ample room for all your goods and grain. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' And God said to him, 'You are such a fool, because tonight your soul will be required of you. And then all these possessions that you've accumulated, whose will they be?' So it is for everyone who stores up treasure here on earth, but is not rich towards God." Word of God, word of life. Please be seated. In the reading from Colossians that you just heard, St. Paul says, "So if you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things that are above, not on things that are on earth." In other words, Paul is telling us to set our minds on the things that are above, on the things that are eternal, not on the things that are passing away. In short, to be heavenly minded and not earthly minded. Heavenly minded. That word has been twisted and misused down through the centuries. One egregious example was by Southern slave owners prior to the Civil War. And they would tell those who were enslaved to just think about heaven and not about earth. Think of the joys that awaited them there. And the reason they said that was not because they were so enamored of heaven, but because they didn't want the slaves to rise up and rebel and demand their freedom. It was a way to maintain the status quo, a way to justify the horrors of slavery. But when heavenly mindedness is rightly understood, it does just the opposite. Heavenly mindedness can inspire us to make the world a better place, to right wrongs, to undo injustices. It can be a way of making heaven come to earth. The words of Jesus in the Lord's Prayer, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it already is in heaven." C.S. Lewis, in his little book, Mere Christianity, said this about heavenly mindedness. He said, "A continual looking forward to the eternal world is not, as some modern people think, a form of escapism or wishful thinking, but one of the things a Christian is meant to do. It does not mean that we are meant to leave the present world the way it is. If you read history, you will find that the Christians who did most for the present world were just those who thought most of the next. The apostles themselves, who set foot on the conversion of the Roman Empire, the great men who built up the Middle Ages, the English evangelicals who abolished the slave trade, all left their mark on earth precisely because their minds were occupied with heaven. It is largely since Christians have stopped thinking of the other world that they have become so ineffective in this. Aim at heaven, and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth, and you will get neither. So what Lewis is telling us is that as Christians we believe that in heaven there will be no slavery. We will be free in every way, body, mind, and spirit. And so we work now here in this world to end slavery in all its forms. And we believe that in heaven there will be no hunger. Everyone will be full. And so we work here on earth to bring an end to hunger so that no child and no person goes to bed at night hungry. And we believe that in the world to come, there will be no homeless, that Christ is preparing a mansion for each of us. And so we work tirelessly to end homelessness here on this earth. The list could go on and on about the ways in which we are called to bring heaven to earth. So Jesus' kingdom comes and his will is done here on earth. William Wilberforce is one of my heroes. He was born in 1759 in England on the eastern coast in a little town called Hull. So he was about a generation after the founding fathers here in America, to give you some historical context. He was born to wealthy merchant parents. He was very bright. He went to Cambridge University, graduated at 21. He was elected to Parliament and then became the MP for the District of Yorkshire. And he was a rising star along with William Pitt, and he had a bright future ahead of him. But then when he was 25, he went on vacation and he read this little classic by William Law, A Serious Call to a Devout and Holy Life. And that book changed his life. He had a rebirth of his faith. He wanted to follow Jesus more closely. And he began to wonder if he could do that as a politician in Parliament. Or were politics and following Jesus mutually exclusive? And so he arranged a secret meeting with John Newton. And Newton had been a slave trader back in the early 1700s, but in 1748, he came to faith in Jesus. And he rejected his captaincy on a slave trading boat. He started to speak out against the slave trade. And then he was called to ordained ministry, so he studied theology, became a pastor, and was serving a small church in London. And in fact, in 1772, I think it was, he wrote a hymn about that experience. And the hymn was Amazing Grace. Well, Wilberforce asked Newton what he should do. Should he remain in Parliament? Should he do something different? And this is what Newton said. He said, God has raised you up for the good of the church and the good of the nation. Maintain your friendship with Pitt. Continue in Parliament. Who knows that for such a time as this, God has brought you into public life and has a purpose for you. So he stayed in Parliament. He wondered what God had in mind for him. But it didn't take long to find out. The Quakers were staunch abolitionists. They were doing everything they could to bring slavery to an end. But they needed an advocate in Parliament, someone who would hold hearings, do investigations, using the power of their position to shine a light on the horrors of slavery. And in Wilberforce, they thought they had their man. And so they approached him and asked him if he would be the champion for the abolitionist movement in Parliament, and he agreed. And so in 1790, Wilberforce gave his first speech in Parliament advocating for the end of the slave trade in the British Empire. And he spent 3 hours telling them about the slave trade, about how these Africans were lined up, laying in the holds of ships like sardines, about the disease, the starvation, the death, about how some of the captains, when there was a storm, would throw some of their cargo overboard to lighten the ship, about all the horrors of the Middle Passage. And after 3 hours, he ended by saying, after all this, you may choose to look away, but you can never again say, you did not know. He introduced a bill to end the slave trade in the British Empire, and it was defeated massively in Parliament. It was because There was fierce resistance. There were very powerful people who had a vested interest in slavery. It was very profitable. In 1807, just in the city of Liverpool, 17 million pounds changed hands over the buying and selling of people. He was excoriated in the newspapers. He was ridiculed in the public. He was physically assaulted on the streets of London. He got death threats, and so he had to travel about with a bodyguard. And even though he was discouraged initially, he kept bringing the bill forward to end the slave trade. And it was at that time that he got a letter from John Wesley, who was the founder of the Methodist Church. Wesley was very old, near the very end of his life. In fact, this letter was the last one he wrote before he died, and he said this to Wilberforce. He said, "Dear sir, unless the divine power has raised you up, I see not how you can go through your glorious enterprise in opposing that execrable villainy, which is the scandal of religion, of England, and of human nature. Unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who can be against you? Are all of them together stronger than God? Oh, be not weary of well-doing. Go on, in the name of God and in the power of his might, till even American slavery, the vilest that ever saw the sun, shall vanish away before it." And so Wilberforce persisted. Every year he brought the bill forward in Parliament to end slavery. Every year it was defeated. But public opinion was starting to turn. People were learning more and more about what actually happened in the slave trade and in slavery. And so finally, in 1807, February 23rd, at 4 o'clock in the morning, the British Parliament passed a bill to end the slave trade in the British Empire. The first time it was done anywhere in the world. When the vote was announced, everyone in Parliament stood up and for 10 minutes gave Wilberforce a standing ovation and 3 distinct cheers. Wilberforce put his head in his hands and he wept. Almost 20 years of hard labor had finally borne fruit. It was a historic day, and in 2007, that medal was struck to commemorate it. And this was one of the lines that Wilberforce used again and again and again. Are we all brethren? Slave trade abolished by Great Britain, 1807. We are brothers and sisters. We are all humans. The slave trade was illegal, but not slavery itself. And so Wilberforce persisted, trying to bring slavery to an end in Great Britain. He continued on until 1825, when he retired from Parliament. He was just getting too old. But the battle continued, and finally, in 1833, just a few days before his death, he got word that the British Parliament had outlawed slavery in the British Empire, the first country to do it. After his death, Parliament voted overwhelmingly to have Wilberforce buried in Westminster Abbey. Even though he was a commoner, Westminster Abbey is reserved for the royalty and nobility of British society. He was so highly revered and respected. And his influence didn't stop in the British Empire. He influenced Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass in the fight against slavery here in the U.S. And because of Wilberforce and others, Britain didn't have to go through a civil war like we did to bring slavery to an end. They found a peaceful way to do it. Wilberforce once said this: "A private faith that does not act in the face of oppression is no faith at all." He said that because of his faith, because he believed in the glory that awaits us, that Jesus came, that he died, that he rose, that he lives for us, so that we can be perfectly free for all eternity. because he was so heavenly minded, he did so much earthly good. So set your minds on the things that are above. Meditate on that vision of heaven and all that awaits us. And let that vision inspire you to do as much earthly good as you possibly can. Amen.